Welcome to the special board of directors meeting of September 22nd, 2022 at 4 p.m. This is leading to a financial workshop. Manager, please.
Well, I think we can
Or do we want to do an
roll call.
Yes, roll call, please.
Directors Sethy, Akbari,
Here.
Gunther,
Here.
Huang, here, and Weed.
Here. Director Sethy will be joining us shortly. So let's do that. Please join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible. Thank you. I was at a meeting yesterday in the Alameda County where they said if no one from the public is there, no need to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I prefer to say the pledge.
Well, we do have a member of the public joining us. Mr. Kelly A is online, and others from staff are also online.
Great, thank you. All right, we now have public comments. Is there anyone who wishes to address the board on a matter which is on this agenda?
And I can do some quick housekeeping remarks to make sure everybody who is on board does know how to participate. So real quickly, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Stevenson. I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this board meeting in person or remotely by either using the Zoom application or by telephone. Any member of the public participating in person may approach the speaker's podium at the appropriate time. For those participating remotely, note that the meeting agenda, staff reports, and presentation materials are all available on the district's website at acwd.org. You may reference the instructions at the top of the agenda for how to participate using the controls in the Zoom app or your dial pad if participating by telephone audio. This hybrid board meeting is being recorded and will be made available to the public for future viewing. And that completes my housekeeping remarks. And we do see a hand up from Mr. Abreu.
Yes, Mr. Brew. Under public comments.
Okay, thank you. On the subject of pricing, first off, I'd like to just give a nod to some articles that came out about St. George, Utah, which is one of the fastest growing places in America. And now they're running into problems with not enough water. It's near the Grand Canyon, it's a desert. But they have they use some of the most water in America. They use a lot of water per person, and not a coincidence, they also have the lowest water prices of almost any city in America, according to the newspapers. So low prices go along with high levels of consumption. It shouldn't be a surprise. And also, when it comes over here in the State Water Project, when we're doing all these forecasts, a lot of these water utilities will use, 55% allocation, 60% allocation from the state water forecast. Nobody expects to get 100%, but they're taking the numbers that the state is giving you as 50 or 55% as a future allocation going forward or long term. If you look back over the last 10 years, the allocation has been about 35%. 35% is a lot lower on average than 55%. And so they're charging you a lot of money and telling the State Water Project is charging a lot of money, telling everybody that they're going to deliver a lot of water. And of course, there's no guarantee that they're going to meet that promise. And in fact, over the last 10 years, they've fallen far, 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 far short of delivering the amount of water that they were promising. And then finally, how the pricing works here. I didn't really understand this, but it turns out that the State Water Project charges a lot of money per year for the debt service. And then they charge an additional amount of money to the people who paid to enlarge the South Bay Aqueduct, which might be ACWD. I'm not sure, but I bet you that we are paying for that. So that's every year we've got debt service for the aqueduct, for two aqueducts, the the main state water project and for our little South Bay aqueduct. And it's a lot of money. And it turns out that some of the water companies, I haven't looked at these at your financials yet, but some of the water companies, they pretend like that's not really part of the water rates. That just goes into your property taxes. So we've got this scam going on where water companies pretend like we're going to have giant new projects like Sites Reservoir, like Delta Conveyance, like Fix the State Water Project, like whatever. And these huge, massive capital projects, we're not jacking up the water rates. You know, everybody pretends like we're just, throwing it into your property taxes. And people are going to have to pay, the taxpayers are going to have to pay one way or another. But somehow it's being hidden in the property taxes and not in the water rates, even though the reason, you build dams and reservoirs and canals is because you're paying for water. So it's a very unusual game, very well hidden, very carefully crafted, and it's escaped my attention until about yesterday. Thanks.
All right, thank you, sir. Please let the record show that Director Sethy returned at the start of public communications. Thank you, Mr. Brew. And Mr. Brew is the only member of the public.
There's another member of the public, Mr. Nishimura, who's joined. I don't see a hand up at the moment.
All right. So if there's this time we're told there are no.
And I'm sorry, there is one other member of the public, Monica Ashbacher. And again, I don't see a hand up right now.
Okay, fine. So if there's no additional public comment, we will then move on to the financial workshop, which for the finances for the calendar year 2022.
Oh, sure. Well, this is the third workshop in a series of 3 scheduled workshops for this year that are focusing on the district's current and projected financial status, water rates and charges, rate structures, the allocation between fixed and variable charges, including current use of a property tax related to the state water project costs, the approach to funding the capital improvement program, stage rates that could be charged during a water shortage emergency, and use of the property tax roll for collecting on delinquent accounts. So the first workshop in the series was held on July 20, and the second was held on August 25th. So at this time, I'll turn it over to our Director of Finance and Administration, Mr. Wunderlich.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Stevenson, and good afternoon, board, staff, and members of the public. At this time, I'll ask if the district secretary can go ahead and start the presentation slides. And we will go ahead and just go to the next slide. Great. So we've got a few things to do today. As Mr. Stevenson said, this is the third of hopefully 3 workshops. And we've covered quite a bit of ground at our prior workshops in July and August. And so we'll just quickly recap that. We also just wanted to make sure one last time we present the financial planning assumptions and metrics and just make sure everybody's comfortable there. Nothing has changed since what you saw in August. So we're not looking for any changes here. We just want to make sure it's presented and everybody understands and is comfortable. The focus tonight will be on options for drought surcharges, commonly called stage rates. And we do have with us Mr. Mahalchek and Mr. Farnkop from our consultants, HF&H, who will lead the discussion on that section. And then at the August workshop, we did talk about, again, taking a look at our state water project override tax, as was actually referenced in the public comments this afternoon. And so we will take a quick look at that today as well. All right, next slide. So as mentioned, this is the third in a series of workshops. We also had 2 meetings focused on financial information earlier in the year, specifically on the district budget. And so we are here again, primarily following up from discussions that occurred in August. So we'll go with the next slide. And the focal point from staff's perspective today is to get board feedback and direction about how we will approach drought surcharges, as well as the approach to the state water project override tax. And then those are kind of the final 2 pieces of board guidance we're looking for before we can go back and prepare the formal study and notice that would come to the board in December for consideration of issuing a Proposition 218 notice. Next slide. Okay, so to just recap in a little more detail what we did at the prior workshops in July, we did get some direction to maintain the current uniform rate structure, as well as the current ratio between service and commodity charges. So for example, what staff is recommending is 4% rate increases for the next 2 years, which would be applied uniformly to both service and commodity charges. We also talked about approaches to funding the CIP. Our current financial planning assumptions are based on spending down available reserves the next several years due to substantial CIP projects that are planned, including for reservoirs, pipelines, PFAS treatment, advanced green infrastructure. And so what was discussed was that we would wait until current reserves are spent down before considering alternative approaches to funding our capital program. And again, it was requested that we bring certain items back in August, which was done. So we can go to the next slide. And then in August, one of the main topics we talked about was the approach to collecting on delinquent accounts. And so we did receive direction to begin the process to supplement existing collections protocols with an annual referral to the property tax roll for delinquencies on owner-occupied single-family residential accounts. Can also inform the board that we have initiated our outreach with county staff to begin that process. There are a few steps we will need to go through, and there will actually be a few board actions between now and next summer to kind of make all of those things line up. And so you'll actually probably start to see some things related to that, I would guess, later, before the end of this calendar year. We could go back. And then again, we confirmed the approach as far as rate increase amounts to make sure we maintain our financial stability. And then that we should come back with additional analysis and information on our approach to the state water project override tax, as well as preparing additional drought surcharge scenarios. And so that's what we are here to do this evening. And there were a number of scenarios included in the presentation materials. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Alm, our financial analysis supervisor, who will walk us through the financial planning assumptions and metrics.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Wanderley. Good afternoon, members of the board, public and staff. So for this part of the presentation, I will briefly just highlight the financial planning assumptions and the metrics. As Mr. Wanderley mentioned, you've seen this before. There's no changes from the August workshop, but since we are seeking board feedback and direction on key issues that was mentioned, we want to make sure that you see this again, just in case there are any questions. So I'll go through this very briefly. So one of the key assumptions, obviously, is the projected bill demands. So currently, it's based on conservation target and a modest rebound in the coming years. And the model included the water rate increases from SFPUC. That's including 15.9% increase that went into effect in July. And then future increases as well. It's included contribution to CalPERS for pension and retiree health benefits, also known as OPEB. That's going to be maintained at the aggressive level. We presented to Finance Committee the evaluation from CalPERS on Tuesday. It looked good on pension side as of June 30th, 2021, but given the current market condition, we maintaining the level, the aggressive level, to get the program fully funded in about 10 years makes sense. Labor and benefits costs are consistent with the approved labor contracts. And the financial plan includes full funding of the capital improvement program that was approved by the board in June as part of the budget process, and added costs for the PFAS treatment that you saw or you discussed in August. Debt issuance, so the long-range financial planning model assume debt issuance to help fund the capital improvement program. The exact amount of the issuance will depend on the condition at that time of issuance. Currently, the model assumes a $30 million debt issuance in fiscal year 24-25. And as Mr. Wonderlich mentioned, the big assumption is the annual 4% uniform rate increase for the next 2 years, and then a 3% increase after that. So this is one of the key metrics that the board are interested in looking at, the general fund ending balances. As we're spending down our cash reserve, what this chart shows is that the district is spending down the cash reserve that, as you see there in fiscal year 22 and 23, that's going to get spent down over the planning horizon. This is the bill demand that I mentioned. So current fiscal year, there's a dip there from last fiscal year, anticipating a rebound, but that's based on the current assumption. We will have to pay attention to what happened this winter, look at the weather for this winter and the next winter. And our plan is to come back and update our forecast in the spring as part of the budget process. As we spend down our cash balance, our net revenue is trending down compared to our annual debt service. So the effect of that is our debt coverage ratios are going to be trending down as well. But as you can see here, they are above the target level of 200%. The lowest year, as you see there, is 300%. So very strong. Or as you know, as well as the public know, our credit rating is very strong. We're the highest rated by S&P and AA1 by Moody. This metric here looks at revenues, operating revenues and operating expenses. As you see there, there's funding gaps, but what that means is that the district relies on other funding sources to cover operating expenses. So in the current fiscal year, where the district anticipate over $17 million in property tax revenues and interest income to help cover the operating expenses. So this metric looks at just the rate and charge revenue, compare that to revenue requirement. Again, the district relies on other funding sources, including the accumulated reserve over the years to fully fund the annual operations, debt service payment, and capital program. Speaking of our capital program, this shows what is planned, the planned expenditures over the planning horizon. The 3 years in the middle of the fiscal year there for all fund that total approximately $180 million. So over the next 3 years, very aggressive spending plan. And we also assume, as I mentioned, a $30 million debt issuance to help fund the program. So the focus is on the drought surcharge alternative, but before we get into that, I just wanted to provide a brief drought stage outlook for 2023. So based on the current forecast, look like we're gonna have a 4th year of a drought year ahead of us. The district's imported water supply remain limited, but they are available and accessible. Groundwater level trending similar to last year. Customer water demands currently meeting our 15% system-wide conservation targets, and I wanted to say kudos to our water conservation program and public affairs teams, for their public engagement and outreach. They did a great job on that. So given the current information and the forecast, staff anticipates a 15% conservation target at stage 2 will continue to be sufficient for 2023. If there's dramatic changes to the conditions or to our assumption, then obviously that's going to change, but that's not anticipated at this time. So with that, I wanted to pause here for a moment to see if you have any questions on what I just went over. Yes, Director Sethy.
If we can go back to slide number 12. So before I joined the board, the district was continually not covering its operating expenses with operating revenue, including depreciation. And we worked very concertedly to get to that point where operating revenues covered all operating expenses, including depreciation and amortization. And now I see us falling backward here. And we're okay for the next fiscal year. But as we start going out, I don't think we're being realistic in terms of the actual rate increases that are necessary to cover the depreciation amortization. And the reason I've always emphasized this as a best practice in business, like in the corporate world, is that you free up the other cash that you have for paying down your unfunded liabilities and for use in capital improvements. So that's my comment.
Right. Thank you. Comments from the members of the board? What I always find it interesting that we come up with the definition for operating revenue, which apparently includes the commodity cost, because the bulk of our 2/3 of our revenue is commodities. So how we make that distinction in our budgeting process has been one of the mysteries of our financial process to me. The second comment I would make is I'd be interested in looking, we have a 2-year budget. If we look at our planning forecast of 2 years ago and 4 years ago, my recollection is those graphs are remarkably similar. We have a planning group, and that we just seem to just basically move the years and keep the same barge elevations cycle after cycle after cycle. And we don't see that drop off that we in our funded ratios, et cetera, from year to year, from budget cycle to budget cycle. So I believe it'd be worthwhile for us to go back and look at what our how the reliability of our past forecast, and to see if we are being realistic in this forecast. So thank you.
If I may add to President Weed's comment, we don't have to do this tonight, but what I would be interested in seeing in a future, let's say, finance committee meeting is what are the rate increases necessary to make sure that we cover all operating expenses, including depreciation and amortization? And I would feel more comfortable knowing what that outlook is, because I think that's the most realistic outlook financially for the district.
Would that be a rate increase on the service charge or the commodity charge?
Well, that's to be decided by the board.
Thank you.
So if I could just add a quick comment, and certainly we'll prepare something for a future committee meeting. But back in July, we did provide a pretty comprehensive review for the board as far as past results compared to budgeted amounts. And absolutely, our results tend to be better in terms of more money in the bank than projections. We do make a number of intentionally conservative assumptions in our financial planning so that we don't risk falling into an uncomfortable territory. One of the things that we've done here in this process is we've included a $30 million debt issuance 3 years out in our financial planning. And so should we continue to experience what we have in the past as we move forward, then you can think of that debt issuance as an accordion that can become bigger or smaller based on our actual financial status in 3 years. So I am optimistic that we will be spending these reserves down successfully over the next few years.
Thank you. Okay. Any other further comments on the board or from the staff? Thank you for your.
Thank you.
All right.
Now we'll turn this over to our consultant from HF&H. Thank you.
All right. And while our staff from our consultants from HF&H are getting situated, just as a reminder, they're going to be going through a lot of drought surcharge scenarios for the board to consider. This is being responsive to feedback we received from the board about different options you would like to see. But as a reminder, we do have a surcharge that is currently in effect. So we're not talking about going from no surcharge to one of these options. We have something in effect. It is working as designed. It's meeting the district's policy objectives. And so, again, staff will take what direction we receive tonight. But from our perspective, we do have something in place, and continuing what's in place would be an option that we would encourage the board to consider also in its deliberations this afternoon. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Farnkopf and Mr. Mahalchek from HF&H.
President Weed, members of the board, good afternoon. Unfortunately, Rick Simonson is unable to be here this afternoon, but I think that between Jeff and me and staff, we can work you through this.
Sir, could you move the microphone, please, a little closer to your, okay. thank you.
Okay, yeah, all right, we'll try to speak into it. Does that help?
Helps,
Okay,
yes.
great. All right. Could you do this? Yep. Okay, and no, oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So this is what we'd like to cover with you right now. Just review where we left things off in August. We'll then talk about the alternatives or options for stage rates that were of interest to you. We'll present some of the analysis that Jeff has prepared. I'll let him discuss that, and then we'll show what the bill impacts are before we kind of open things up for you to discuss and provide some additional input. So back in August, we came forward with three options. Option one was what we called the fixed surcharge. We looked at two variants on that, one where it was an equal charge per account, and the other was graduated like your service charges from low to high based on the size of meters. Option two is what you're doing currently, uniform charge per 100 cubic feet. Right now, all customers are paying that surcharge. It's applied to all water use. And then option three, tiered charges. We looked at that. We provided some for you to look at, and you asked for some additional direction. Excuse me, so additional detail on that. What we heard from you was that there was not a lot of support for option one, the fixed surcharge approach, but you were, I think, all supportive of continuing with option two, the uniform charge per 100 cubic feet for commercial customers. And you were also interested in seeing some additional analysis on the option three scenarios, where in all cases, there are two tier structures, tier one and tier two. We used 1,200 cubic feet on a bi-monthly basis as a break point. That works out to 55 gallons per day for a household of three. And that's really just inside water use, no allowance there for irrigation. And you wanted to see some examples that had the surcharge for tier one or no surcharge for tier one, and it was all recovered through tier two. And you also wanted to see examples where as the stage increased, the reduction had to increase, the break point diminished or decreased. So the option two example, which is what you're doing right now, is shown here. You know, you're using it for commercial. You could continue to use it for residential if that's what you decided to do. These numbers have been updated a little bit. Jeff, I think you were saying that they're pretty similar to what you currently have right now. Now in option three, this is where it gets more complicated. What we're looking at here are some permutations or sub options, and they kind of pair off. Options 3A and 3B apply a surcharge to consumption, either all of the consumption in 3A, and it would be tiered, where tier one is based on recovering the costs associated with conservation at that level, and then tier 2, conservation and revenue shortfall at all demand above 1,200 cubic feet. In 3B, the surcharge would only apply to the higher tier, to tier 2. Options 3, C, and D pair off. These are both options that have breakpoints that decrease as the stage reduction increases. You can also think about pairing off option 3A with 3C. In both of those options, the surcharge is paid at all levels of consumption, whereas in 3B and 3D, the surcharge is only applying to the tier 2, the higher water use. So that's just generally what we're going to be talking about here. I'm going to let Jeff continue by walking you through each of the tables that illustrate these examples.
So option 3A example, this is all consumption, but consumption below 12 pays a lower surcharge. At stage 2A, consumption below 12 pays an additional 19 cents per HCF, and consumption above 12 pays an additional $1.91 per HCF. And you'll notice that the breakpoint stays the same as the stages progress. It's 12 HCF. And then you'll notice the tier 2 surcharge at stage 6 is $58.18 per HCF, which is a little bit unreasonable.
And Jeff, you can explain what's going on there.
Yeah, so as the stages increase, you're losing out on more and more revenue, but the breakpoint, the consumption above the breakpoint doesn't diminish as fast as your lack of revenue from consumption increases. So dividing one number by the other, your numerator is increasing faster than your denominator, and that's why your tier 2 surcharge increases much faster than it should. And option 3B, consumption above 12 pays a surcharge. So consumption below 12 does not pay any surcharge. You'll notice that as the stages progress, the tier 2 rates for both options 3A and 3B also get a little unreasonable, which is why we developed options 3C and 3D. You'll notice it's $89.50 for per HCF increase in the bill. So it's with options 3C and 3D, we examined what the surcharges would be if the breakpoint diminished as the stages progress. So stage 2A, consumption below 12 pays 19 cents per HCF, and consumption above 12 pays $1.91 extra. This is the same as option 3A. However, at the higher stage levels, the breakpoint diminishes, so there's more consumption that pays the tier 2 surcharge, and we end up with a much more reasonable surcharge. Option 3D, only consumption above the breakpoint pays a surcharge, and that breakpoint diminishes as the stages progress. At stage 2A, all consumption above 12 pays an additional $2.28 per HCF, which is the same as option 3B. And at stage 6, there is a much more reasonable $6.64 per HCF surcharge, which is the same as option 3C. So I put together some tables that show how these surcharges affect customer bills. We looked at stages 2A, 3A, and 4. At stage 2A, customers using 8 HCF won't see an increase to their bills with options 3B and 3D, but see a greater bill as their consumption increases to 32 HCF. Same general pattern exists at stage 3A. No bill impacts with options 3B and 3D. And at lower consumption levels, but a much greater impact as consumption rises up to 32 HCF. So you'll see option 3B $103.87 at 32 HCF. And here are bill impacts at stage 4. Note that with option 3D, the breakpoint is at 4 HCF, so customers using 8 HCF will see an impact on their bills. Before in 3D, they wouldn't see one before, but now with the stage 4 breakpoint at 4 HCF, they have now seen an impact on their bill. And I can pause there for some questions before we move on to the summary.
Are there any questions from members of the board? Questions or points of clarification from the staff? Is there any comment from members of the public on this presentation? Apparently none, so let's please.
See Kelly A. raising hand.
Yes, Kelly A.
Okay, thank you. The 12 CCF or 12 HCF seems like a very arbitrary number. I just looked at Hayward, for example, and the average customer in Hayward as of several years ago was using about 2 2/3 of this. So it would be 8 HCF per month or whatever. So the 12 HCF in most of the East Bay cities and the Oakland or wherever East Bay mud terms is higher than the 50th percentile of households. This is it's a big number, and it's more than indoor use for a typical household. I just think that 12 is a big number. Also, when the breakpoints drop, I kind of agree with that. As surcharges go on, you should expect the breakpoint to go down, but not down to 0. It should go down. For example, if you have a 50% conservation, then the breakpoint would perhaps drop in half because you expect the smaller people to be conserving just like the bigger people. You put in that conservation expectation and you drop your breakpoint a little bit, but you don't drop it all the way down to 0 because that's unreasonable. And you always would be giving the little customer a break. And it's just, a lot of these things are, they're not really a lot, they're kind of arbitrary numbers. They're not really aligned to what is the 50th%, the median household doing, or the first quartile, which is the 25th percentile household doing. It's got to be aligned to those kind of metrics. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Further comments from members of the board? Oh, Mr. Nishimura, you wish to speak?
Thank you, President. Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? I think you can.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So my comments are the following, right? So I looked at the proposals. I question the, I guess, 3A and 3C, where the tier 1 is paying 19 cents surcharge. I understand the logic behind trying to do that because it lessens the surcharge in tier 2, but it sort of diminishes the argument that if you conserve, we're not penalizing you, right? I think that's the powerful message that you want to have. So based on that, I would opt for something, either an option 3B as in boy, or 3D, where the people who are below a threshold don't get penalized at all. I do agree that option 3B as in boy, if you don't reduce the breakpoint, results in eye-watering surcharges, by the time you get to stage 6, and therefore I do support the concept in option 3D as in dog, where you have no surcharge in tier 1, where you can actually, state unequivocally that if you remain below a certain breakpoint and do your part to conserve, you don't get hit with a drought surcharge. And I also do believe that, yes, that breakpoint should go, diminish as the stages go up, as the drought situation gets worse. I am okay with letting the breakpoint go to 0, because I think if we ever get to something like stage 6, that's where you can make an argument that everybody's gets hit with the surcharge. But, hopefully we'll stay within, stage 2, A or B, hopefully, and I do support having, some amount of water being delivered to each customer without being hit with a surcharge. Whether, the break point should start at 12, that's up for debate. And I think that's something that the board can consider, modulating the size of the break point. But the general concepts that I support are that tier 1 should be 0 and that the break point should be diminishing. So option 3D is the closest to what I would prefer. Thank you.
And thank you. Any further comments? I don't see any other hands raised in the public, so let's proceed with the next section. Thank you.
And if I might just add a couple of quick comments, just as a point of clarification, these are bi-monthly bills. I think in one of the comments it referenced monthly. So these are bi-monthly. In our typical residential customer, kind of our median residential bill is about 16 HCF. So a break point of 12 bi-monthly is actually below the average bill. And then the units of 8, 16, and 32 are not chosen completely at random in terms of providing these comparisons. 16 is average. 8 would be a thrifty home, whether that's thrifty because it's a small household in terms of numbers of people, or whether it's thrifty because they're very water conscious. It could be either way. But then 32 is, kind of from staff's perspective, the upper bound of what might be considered reasonable and appropriate use. Our current ordinance allows watering up to 2 days per week in the summer. So we're not at a drought stage where we're saying it's kind of a high level emergency where it's public health and safety only, right? So, between a larger household that may have 5 or 6 people in it, that's watering consistent landscape watering with our current ordinance, you can very reasonably get up to 32 as what's kind of staff's perspective, that's about the upper end of what we would reasonably expect. And so that's why we provide these options for the comparison, so you can see how it affects a range of customers. But I just wanted to provide that additional clarification, and we'll hand it back to HF&H to walk us through the remaining slides.
All right, thank you. I have one additional request from the public, Monica Ashbacher.
Yes,
please.
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
also support option 3D for all the reasons that were mentioned. I think it's really easier to reward people who are thrifty, and then with the HCFs, I guess, for larger households, it's not their fault that they're larger households, so I guess it's kind of reasonable to have those thresholds where they are currently. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, okay, let us move on then to your next section.
All right. Well, if you bear with me, my next section is something I'd like to. I'm trying to go backward. Yeah, here we go. Jeff has just shown you what the surcharges amount to, and what I'd like to do is just one more time go through what the surcharge rates look like here. We saw here in 3A and also 3B that as you get up into stage 4 and above, these surcharges become very high, and they might even be regarded as punitive, which they aren't. These are calculated to be revenue neutral, but I think at these amounts, they certainly will give the impression that people are being penalized. That's 3A and 3B. Those, they just really take off when you get into those upper stages. What's interesting in 3C and 3D is the rates are very similar, whether you have a tier 1 surcharge or not. If you just look at the gradation there from the lowest stage to the highest stage, that's 3C and that's 3D. Not much of a difference. So it might be more of a messaging difference than a financial difference. So these were the impacts that Jeff showed. And, when you look at it at, your current stage 2, these impacts are fairly similar at the higher levels. Things start to, the higher surcharges are with options 3A and 3B. And by the time you get to the stage 4, 40% cutback, these are quite substantial amounts for higher water use. And still, on a bi-monthly basis, what you're seeing for 800 cubic feet for low use is not too bad, frankly. So this is kind of the ballot, you might say. This is a list of all of the options we've been looking at here. Again, just kind of repeating what we've shown you before, just to help facilitate some further discussion on this and any input that you can provide us.
Question on my part. Do each of your options generate the same amount of additional revenue for the district on the surcharges?
Yes, they're theoretically revenue neutral. We did have to make some assumptions on how much demand is reduced at the different breakpoints. So from breakpoint 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. We didn't have perfect data on figuring out how much that consumption was diminished. So we had to use some reasonable consumption. So as far as those assumptions are correct, then this is all revenue neutral.
What
I would
would be the
say,
range and loss of income based on the various options that you're looking at?
I don't think that the assumptions are all that sensitive to the results. They may be off by a few cents here and there.
Okay, so it's basically stable across the board, and you're not anticipating a great deal of change in the actual amount of water sold based on the various rate options.
No, the water sales would go down, but we would
He's
stay
saying-
revenue neutral.
Well, he's saying that the water, that various, based on their various options, which have significant changes at the upper level, that the real impact on consumption is nominal changes, minor changes in the total amount of revenue, is what I believe he just said.
At each stage, like we're at stage 2 right now, if we go to stage 3, you're revenue neutral, but you have lower consumption.
Well, then the question is, what is the difference in revenue? And he was saying
It's
that they're
revenue,
basically,
it's revenue neutral.
okay. And then the difference in sales then might be the better quantity. How much difference in water consumption would we have at each stage?
You would have 15% reduction in consumption, 20%.
Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, so if we go back to
Going back to
this slide, you can see the demand reduction in
Okay,
each
so the
stage.
demand reduction is here based on each of the,
Right.
as we step through the stages.
And we had to make some assumptions based on each breakpoint, how much of the 15%, 20% would come from above the breakpoint versus below the breakpoint. So as long as those assumptions are accurate, then this is all revenue neutral.
Okay. And do you believe those changes in demand reduction are based on social media or on rates?
We looked at July 2020 data versus July 2022 data. So July 2022 data had 15% demand reduction, and we sort of used that as the starting point and estimated demand reduction at the other stage.
So that is a demand a reduction that occurred without a change in rates. That was based on the general trend to promote various conservation efforts in the area.
Yeah, we generally tried to reduce the demand based on a trend. Again, we had imperfect data, and so we just had to use some reasonable assumptions.
Okay. And the gist behind my comments is I do not believe in rate-based conservation. I don't believe it's effective, and I don't believe it's ever been shown to be effective.
I
Thank you.
Director
believe
Weed,
Mr. Wonder has a comment.
if I could just clarify, we have a surcharge in effect today that was applied to the July 2022 use that was used in this comparison. Now, Is the reduction in demand driven by that surcharge? Probably not. I think it's mostly driven by district messaging and statewide messaging about the severity of the drought and the lack of water supply. So I don't think that's the case. You know, in terms of these different stages and approaches, they're all calculated to be revenue neutral. We have made, as Mr. Mahalchek said, we've made certain assumptions. We think those assumptions are reasonable, but we do not know what will happen in the real world with these different options. I would think that there's a certain amount of risk with any option, but certainly the more significant the surcharge is, I think the more likely it is to potentially drive customer behavior. And so the more uncertainty you might drive. So say with those options 3A and 3B, you know, you're getting into a 30-40% conservation level and you have a surcharge that's $15 a unit above that break point. Customers will be highly motivated to keep their use below the break point, and you're increasing the risk that you will not be revenue neutral. You'll get more conservation than you expected, especially from above the break point. So I would say the higher the surcharge amount is, the greater the risk is that you won't achieve the revenue neutrality, right? Because you'll get more conservation out of that bucket subject to the surcharge. Now, at a $1 or $2 surcharge, will it adjust people's behavior that much? The surcharge, I don't know, probably not a whole lot. I think the key will be the restrictions in place and the messaging, but certainly as you get to rates, as Mr. Farnkoff alluded to, that to a customer may feel punitive, then I think you might see a lot more adjustment and more uncertainty in maintaining that neutrality.
I'll save my comments for the end then on the philosophy, but
I'd like
Director
to make,
Sethy.
I'd like to make a couple of comments here. First, we had our finance committee this past Tuesday. And the one noteworthy thing to me was that with our stage 2 surcharges in effect, our revenue is within 1% of what it was previously last year, with a 15% reduction in demand. So when we talk about maintaining revenue neutrality, that's, I think, a very, very positive in that respect, that it is working, what we've adopted. Number 2, I want to emphasize what's on slide 5, because this is our third workshop, and we agreed to adopt uniform rates for this rate cycle. And that only we were looking at these other options to see what things might look at in the future. So I'd like the board to at least consider the commitment that we made to uniform rates and the stage rates that we have already adopted moving forward. And number 3, this is only a personal point of view at this point. If we were to adopt one of these options in the future, I would probably lean toward option 3D. But I would have to study it some more. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have nothing, no one from the public? Do we have any comments from members of the board?
I guess
Alright.
I'll start. I definitely like option 3D. I think for me is also a messaging issue. We've been telling our customers that they have to conserve. And I've been out at some of our outreach events, and I have heard from our customers who said, I try my very best to save water. I'm a small water user, but yet you're still penalizing me. And that is actually the word people use. I heard Moses, you are penalizing me for saving water. I save water and you're charging me per unit of water. That just doesn't make sense. I looked at the option 2, the impact between option 2 and option 3D. I definitely like 3D because I think having the diminishing breakpoint actually does track with reality for me. Because the more we have to conserve, the more expensive it is for us to deliver our necessary water because we have to pay more. So it actually does make sense for me to have a diminishing breakpoint. So that's that. I think I said it very clearly last time. I believe small water users, and in this case, we're using 12 because 55 gallons per day, per person per day is actually what currently state defined as efficient indoor water use. And 3 is about the house size here, I think. That's how we end up with 3. So there is a basis for us to start out at 12 HCF, right, as a breakpoint. I think this sends the right message to our customers comparing to what we have right now with option 2. I think it will send a positive message to our small water users saying, hey, thank you for conserving. This is your reward that we are not charging you more for the efficient use portion of your indoor use. And it also sent a message to our larger water customers that says, perhaps you could do a little bit more. So I like 3D, but I definitely understand what you're saying, Director Sethy. I believe even if we decide to adopt this new stage rate, it won't go into effect until what, next year? Mr. Wendell?
Yes, so any changes would require a Prop 218 process based on our current schedule that would go into effect March 1st. You know, knock on wood, we get a good winter. Hopefully the drought surcharge is a temporary condition, right? And so, you know, whether we're maintaining the current surcharge or changing it, hopefully it's only in place for, you know, a limited amount of time.
And that actually brings, so that's my thought on preference to 3D, but I do have a question for you now that you brought in this, hopefully the stage rate, no, we don't have to continue. So what happens if it doesn't rain? Does the stage rate just continues as long as the governor kept the drought emergency?
It is tied to our district's declared water shortage emergency. And the rate, so the stage that we picked is based on our declared by our district water shortage emergency. In December of 2021, the board adopted an ordinance declaring a stage 2 water shortage emergency with achieving a 15% reduction system-wide in water use. And so that is the justification for our current assessment of a stage 2A rate based on 15% conservation.
Okay, we just happen to match up with the state requirement.
Yeah, so that's a coincidence.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Question, if you were to conserve the 15%, I'm going to go back probably a couple of workshops ago. Do you actually see an increase in your bill?
So under our current approach where you pay per unit of water, if you conserve 15%, you will see a very small reduction in your overall bill compared to what you are paying without the surcharge. So, and what we're seeing, you know, from the data is that on a system-wide basis, you know, I don't want to make judgments based on individual customers. Every customer situation is unique, but on a system-wide basis, you know, we are seeing that low water users are conserving and high water users are conserving. And very preliminarily, you know, we are seeing that it's not a situation where only high water users or only low water users. So again, I don't want to comment on individual customer circumstances. We have many efficient water users out there who have limited ability to cut back. But if you do cut back the 15%, then your bill does not go up.
And I think it's also important to note that about a third of our revenue comes from commercial, industrial, institutional customers. We're also putting in their best effort right now too.
Correct. So about that's right. So we also have about 30, I think 31% last fiscal year was the percentage of water revenues from non-residential customers. And yes, they're under the same water use restrictions in terms of how often they can water their landscaping and other things as our residential customers.
The next question, this is a 2-year Prop 218 notice, correct?
Correct. That's yes, that's the plan.
Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Akbari?
if we were to drop that to if we were to go to that zero tier, I guess I have a question. Would we get the same incentive? I'm not so certain. I understand where I understand certainly how that thought of penalty comes in. And I go back and forth on this, by the way. I don't know if anybody's noticed, kind of sliding the other direction. It's at where we are presently. If you conserve the 15%, you've seen no impact. In fact, probably a smaller amount. It's a perception. I mean, once again, it's hey, I'm paying more. Well, you're not really paying more. You're paying more for what you use, certainly. But is that such a wrong thing? Because we're all in this together. Now, all that said, remember, I said I'm holding off on tiered rates because I want AMI. We got a fair amount of AMI in. My meter's not in yet, but you know, where's Ben? Where's my meter? But it's not there yet. This is a 2-year Prop 218. We've had it in effect 1 year. I was one of the proponents of going to the 3D or the third method. And I don't want to swing back, but I'll tell you, right now, I'm kind of thinking that, you know, it's working. The messaging is the same. There is no difference in our 218 notice. Effectively, it's the same thing. We're holding the ground. This is what we told you last time. Realistically, if you conserve, you're not being penalized. You're not paying any more on your water bill. So I may be going on to the other side, by the way, just to give you a heads up. And I kind of hate doing that. But I'm also starting to wonder, are we going to lose some of that lower end conservation if we say, oh, you're good to 12? So the present method's working, and it's not just working. I mean, it's working right on. It's spot on. So our numbers are really spot on. We got it right. And the customers have responded very well. I know there's a perception of penalizing, and I've heard it too. And I understand where they get that feeling. So at the moment, I guess I'm kind of sliding the other direction. Just give you.
If I can just make a short comment to add to Director Gunther. You've heard me say this in the past. Keep it simple and be consistent with our customers. You can't be jerking our customers around from 1 year to the next. And I think consistency and uniformity in what we're doing is part of the image of the district, that we're viewed as being stable. We're not pushing our customers here, there, and everywhere. And so that's one reason I would like to maintain the status quo right now.
So I know we were saying we're not going to talk about specific customer or customer class. I'm just going to say that there are customers in this district that are ultra efficient, that use about 42 gallons per person per day, which is ultra efficient. And these are the customers that will not be able to do the 15% reduction. You just can't. So for our ultra efficient water users in this district, you're basically telling them, thank you for being so efficient in water use throughout your life. Thank you for not going back to increase your water use even after the drought. But guess what? Next time there's a drought, you're guaranteed to have a rate increase because you are efficient and you are not able to decrease your water use. For me, inherently, that is unfair.
Well, like you, Director Huang, I'm willing to consider option 3D in a future rate cycle.
Thank you. Dr. Akbari?
So I think
similar to Director Gunther at the last meeting, I was also in between our status quo and more inclined on option 3D of the different options we have amongst option 3. I think I was leaning more towards moving towards option 3D because I think it sends a better signal to our customers who are being efficient that we're not penalizing them. I think that word's been thrown around quite a bit, but we're not penalizing them if they are able to meet our expectations for conservation. So I'm inclined on moving to that. It does sound like it's
Director Akbari, you are directly contradicting yourself from that meeting. Both you and Director Gunther backtracked and supported the uniform rates that we have and the current stage rates. That's what's on slide 5. And now you're backtrack flip-flopping once again. Well,
okay, no.
I flipped out 3 times on this, so I'm not upset.
First of all,
Good grief.
I didn't finish my comments.
Then finish this.
Be consistent.
Director Sethy, please allow Director Akbari to finish his comments. Yes.
Okay. I see that as a board, we will likely move in that direction at a later date. I don't think we have the votes to move towards option 3D today. I would not vote against option 2 because I do think that it's working, just as Mr. Wunderlich stated earlier. And so that's my position where I'm kind of 50-50 on both options. I have no issue with option 2, but I do see option 3D as being more in line with how I would like to see our rates break down, especially when it comes to stage rates. So that's my comment.
All right. Thank you. My comments are more basic. We're in a surreal discussion here about based on the fact that our rate structure is not grounded. Our commodity costs do not match our commodity expenses, and our fixed costs are out of sync with our actual fixed cost. We use commodity revenues to cover our operational expenses. That's unfortunate. Districts such as South Coast, which have a more appropriate split, do not discuss stage rates. They don't need to. They don't need to go, they didn't go down this rabbit hole. The fundamental argument for that we're having to make in determination as a board is that we're doing this to promote conservation. I believe that's a falsehood. We're doing it to cover a shortfall in revenue that was generated by general conservation programs that have been both at this regional and even our district level, have little to do with rates. In fact, the rates are a catch-up to make up for the revenue shortfalls. So therefore, I'm going to have a difficulty in supporting any stage rate. I'd hope we would go back to where we run into it, or we can eventually evolve into a situation where our commodity cost covers water, power, and chemicals, our variable expenses, and are automatically adjusted when we go into a drought. And the service charge is everything else. So it is not fair to the customers, it's confusing, and it's fundamentally dishonest. So that's my take.
Okay, I have a problem with one of us saying that. I understand that's your opinion. And I just like to say that my opinion is not that opinion. I think our rates are doing pretty darn good. I think we've hit a very good mark. I disagree with you on but this is not the meeting with where our fixed costs lie versus our commodity. And I just want to put it on the record because you put yours on the record as a statement. And so I'm going to put mine on the record as a statement. That's how I feel. Now, whether or not I go to 3D or stay where we are today is a different story. And yes, I have gone back and forth on this. That's my prerogative. Tonight, I'm leaning towards staying where we are. Sorry, but that's kind of where I am right now. I think we've got a good mark. I would like to consider tiered rates in the future, but that's not this meeting. I think we have a good plan. I think staff at this point is comfortable with that plan. And it gives us a set zone where we need to be going into some difficult times. And so I'm just going on the record. I believe our rates are fine. And I support on this deal, the surcharge deal, or whatever you want to call it, brings our revenue to where it needs to be. Makes us whole. We're hitting the mark. Customers are used to it to a degree. It's there's really no change here. Messaging is still the same. If that is that we're going to penalize them, I guess it is, but you know, the messaging is still the same. You save that 15%, your bill doesn't go up, average bill. Yes, there is another group of customers that we have to be careful with. That's the large households. Ones where you have 2 or 3 families trying to make by here in the Bay Area, living under the same roof. You don't have 3 people, you may have 11. And I would like to see that at some point we have some way they could appeal that. If they're in a situation where they have 11 people under one roof. It's not common. It happened with one of my coworkers. East Bay Mud. They were getting hammered. They had like, I think 3 families under one roof. And there's a very difficult problem with that because you got 1 customer. You don't have 3. So I mean, I'm asking the impossible there. I get it. Maybe not the impossible, but it's a far ask. I think maybe we ought to look at that too in the future. Because they wouldn't probably fall under our Help on Tap program. Maybe they might, but 1 customer who could get the Help on Tap. With that, I've said I'm going to support status quo at the moment. And if we could look at that in the future, some way that somebody could appeal. I think we may have had that in there, but if there is a situation where we do have somebody who has a very large household, if they could appeal it, they're showing they're trying to do their reduction, then I'd be interested in that. I don't want to make more work, but I do know that that impact can happen, particularly on the higher rated customer.
If I may, I'd like to buttress Director Gunther's comments, especially on AMI. But first of all, back to slide 5. When the board makes a commitment to staff, I believe we need to keep that commitment. We don't need to jerk around our staff too. Slide number 5 reiterates the board gave direction to staff to maintain the uniform rates, etc. But number 2, from my recollection on our previous 2 financial workshops, was that our consideration of the role of AMI was very important, that we wanted to see what the results would be, like Director Gunther was saying, before we haphazardly made any other choices in our rate structure or stage rates. And we will have nearly all of our AMI implementation completed by the time we're through this next rate cycle. And then I'm very open to considering these other tiered rates or stage rate options that we have here. Thank you very much for your presentation, at least on this portion.
Thank you. If there are no additional clarifications from the staff.
Well, I think it's key that staff receives direction as to what to present to the board in December this evening. And so I hear that there's some favor for option 2, which is a status quo. And there's also some discussion around option 3D. And I personally wasn't 100% clear as to where Director Weed you are. And I think I heard where Director Akbari is, but it might be good for staff if you could just share with us between option 2 and 3D, what direction would you like staff to go?
You heard it.
Got that clear?
I think for the time being.
I'm being option 2.
I think we're at the status quo, although I may be voting no on the whole concept of stage rates. And probably will.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Yeah, no, I was generally understanding that from, I think, Director Weed's earlier comments, but just in terms of, the options that are presented, today and what's still on the table in terms of where we've progressed through this rates cycle. I will just add one, I don't necessarily want to get into kind of the middle of all of this discussion, but I will just say from staff's perspective, the previous direction to maintain uniform rates, I always felt like was about our base rates. I didn't feel like the board had given us that clear direction in relation to the surcharges, which is why we brought the various options tonight.
Thank you.
But I do feel that we have the direction we need for this cycle. And so I think if we are ready, we do have the next section of the presentation to talk about the State Water Project override tax, and we can quickly review that. And then again, I will summarize at the very end in terms of what I think I've heard this afternoon.
Okay. And let me make one quick clarification on
Thank you.
my opposition to surcharge will be based on the philosophical position that, not philosophical, but the position that we have to make a determination, my understanding as a board, that we're doing this to promote conservation. And I don't believe that's the case. So, thank you.
Thank you for your input.
Thank you very much.
Great. So State Water Project override tax. Okay, I think it's my turn now. So we'll go to the next slide. Just again, wanted to quickly remind the board and public what we do. We recover a portion of our state water costs through a property tax assessment. It is clearly identified on property tax bills that it is a state water project override tax. We recover approximately 2/3 of our fixed state water costs through this tax, and that's based on how much of our production capacity comes from groundwater. Variable costs are recovered through the tax based on how state water deliveries are actually used. So in other words, what percentage of deliveries go to groundwater recharge? That share is collected through the tax. And then the share that goes to surface water treatment is collected through our normal water rates. And so this is the methodology we've had in place for about 30 years, or at least about 30 years. And the net result of this is that about 60% of our state water costs are recovered through the property tax. All right, next slide. We have talked about this recently with the board at the last workshop. It was asked that staff go back and do some analysis. And at the present time, staff is not recommending an increase to how much we collect through the tax. We do feel that the current approach is meeting the district's policy objectives. By not increasing the tax, it also retains some additional flexibility in our financial management because it does retain the ability to increase it in the future should that become necessary. And then also we've talked a lot about drought surcharges today and messaging to our customers. I think taking actions that remove a price signal. Now, whether we agree that a price signal is relevant to achieving conservation, putting that aside, I do think in our current drought conditions, customers may find it a bit unusual to take cost recovery out of the water bill, just in our current conditions. And so we do have a number of established substantive and procedural steps that we take in relation to this tax. The revenue is factored into our rates analysis. We have a board adopted resolution every July where we make certain findings. And so we will continue to follow all of those established processes. And again, staff recommends not making any changes at this time. And so that concludes my presentation on this topic, and be happy to take any questions or feedback.
Do you have any questions on members of the board?
None from me.
No question, just that I agree with staff recommendation. that's a good way to go.
I'm good, thank you.
This is an issue which has generating, for a variety of reasons, the use of the state water tax, as well as the billing on the property tax bill as a billing mechanism for rates, is evolving, and it'd be my hope that the property tax bill, including the assessed valuations, will eventually cover a greater, and if not in totality of the cost. So, but we have time. Thank you.
All right,
And
so
President Weed, I'm not seeing any members of the public raising their hands, but certainly if there's any question out there, feel free to raise your hand.
All right. No hands are raised at this time, so let us move them to the next item.
yeah, if I could ask to have the presentation moved back one slide. And so just to recap, we will not plan on making any changes to our state water project override tax. We'll maintain the status quo. What we heard tonight was 3 directors or a majority of the board in support of maintaining our current approach on drought surcharges. And so staff now has all the feedback that is needed to prepare our formal study and draft Proposition 218 rate increase notice. And so what will happen is between now and the December 8th board meeting, we will do our technical work and prepare all the necessary documentation and supporting information. And we will come back at the December 8th board meeting with those reports and notices. And we'll put the question before the board whether to approve that formal notice. And then if that notice is approved, then what will happen is, there has to be that 45-day notice period. And so the notice would go out in late December, most likely, at least 45 days in advance of that February 9th board meeting. And then we would hold a formal public hearing February 9th. And then rates would go into effect March 1st of 2023.
Right.
It's possible as we go and do that additional analysis, some things might change very slightly, not like the 4% rate increase, that won't change. But, you saw 79 cents for the option 2 surcharge. It's possible as we go through and do all our supplemental analysis, that might end up being 81 cents or something like that. So, we'll continue to refine and do more analysis. I would not expect any major changes from what you've seen, though, through these workshops.
Okay.
So with that, I would be happy to take any questions or feedback regarding the next steps in this process.
Do we have questions or comments on the board? No. The question I have, we're involved in 2 major projects, which could require some significant funding on the part of this district. One is Los Vaqueros, the second is the state water project. Any fees associated with those that we would have to collect from the ratepayers, would they have to be part of a 218? And if so, what is our timeline for getting information on requests for funding for either project?
Sure. So in regard to the Los Vaqueros project, I'll start there. Any cost of district participation in that project would have to be funded through water rates. There's no mechanism to use the tax bill for that project. It's not a part of the state water system. It's not a form of district debt that existed before Proposition 13 was passed in 1978. So there's no mechanism other than a voter initiative that we would take to the voters in the future to fund it through a different means. It would have to be funded through water rates. We do have built into our future financial plans participation in that project, and future rate increase estimates do consider the cost of participation. At this point, the district has not made a final commitment to participate in that project. So there is still a future elective decision to be made by this board about whether we will continue to participate. Within the current fiscal year, I believe we have about $1.6 million budgeted for our participation in the project. Now, on the state water project side, our current financial planning assumes that Delta Conveyance is funded 100% through water rates. At a future point in time, as certain legal actions being pursued by the State Department of Water Resources are resolved, we may wish to consider whether we would collect all of those costs through water rates as currently planned, or if we would recover some share of those costs through our existing override tax. And so again, that would be a future decision of the board. At this point in time, our contributions toward that project are relatively minimal to support initial planning efforts. We're not at a point that they're in construction, where debt's been issued, where costs are substantial. So again, at the present, the costs are relatively minor and are fully funded for Delta conveyance through water rates. But again, pending resolution of actions initiated by the Department of Water Resources, there would be an opportunity for the board to consider its approach in the future.
If there was a significant increase on either project in the near term, when would we have to have that information in order to put it in to this 218 process?
Yeah, I am not expecting any significant changes within the next 2 years. I guess that's one benefit of doing a 2-year 218 notice, is that the risk of something major within the 2-year period is relatively low. The current approach on Los Vaqueros is actually to fund the construction of the project through a combination of state and federal grant funds, as well as a debt issuance. And so there would not necessarily be any significant near-term cash outlays from the district for that project. And then again, on the state, on the Delta conveyance project, we are still quite a ways off from breaking ground and getting to a point where costs begin to become more substantial.
And as a reminder, just because we implement a 2-year 218, that doesn't mean that we can't come back anytime between then and do another 218 process if something significant changes. Certainly not what we're planning or hoping for, but it's a possibility.
Thank you.
So on this topic of financing the Delta conveyance, the Delta Conveyance Finance Authority met last Thursday. I will provide some communications from that meeting under confidential attorney-client privilege, which will give us some broader information that DWR, our bond counsel, and then the DCFA general counsel provided at last week's meeting. And I will add some of my own notes. It was a 2-hour meeting and almost all in closed session. So,
right. But whether we put those bills on the property tax or our rates, it would still be, in either case would have to be under 218.
Yeah, so whenever we go through a 218 water rate setting process, a part of that is considering non-rate sources of revenue, such as property taxes. If we did use the property tax process, that is a separate process that doesn't require 218. But when we set the related water rates that factor that in, that is subject to 218 and does need to consider those other revenue sources.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. It's fine. So that's covered. Does that cover
I think that covers everything, President Weed.
our? All right, thank you. Then let us move then to general managers reports, which is item 5.
Okay, just one brief general manager's report this evening, and that's just a reminder that services for BJ Bunting will be on Saturday at 1 o'clock at the Prince of Peace Lutheran Church. And just for the record, that's 38451 Fremont Boulevard in Fremont, so across from Washington High School. I'm planning to be there, and I'm sure many of BJ's other friends and family will be there as well.
Thank you.
And that's all.
Director's comments. Yes, Director Sethy.
I have a couple. I'm down here. Mine are very brief. So I checked in with Aqua today, and we have 50 people that have signed up for our Aqua Region 5 event on October 6th and 7th down in Monterey. We have a capacity of 55. So in case anybody would like to come, it's nice that this has been, pretty much sold out. Capacity is limited by the number of people that can go on the shuttle buses, but we could certainly accept more if people are willing to drive themselves. So right now we have General Manager Ed Stevenson, President Weed, and myself going. So looks like it's going to be a pretty good conference, and I put a lot of effort into it over the spring and summer. Number two, at the district expense, so I'm giving a report 1 month early, Marianne. At the district's expense, I attended a Aqua conference yesterday on an update on voting rights in California. And so there was quite a bit of discussion about the Santa Monica case and the depublication of the appellate court decision, which was in favor of Santa Monica. And now it's been appealed up to the state Supreme Court. There was discussion about this appellate decision and all of the interesting consequences for cities, special districts, and other government agencies that are, we went through the entire process of going to bi-district elections. But Santa Monica has now prevailed with their arguments that it was unnecessary in their city, and there were some certain stipulations that the court made in terms of thresholds that had to be met to go to those by district divisions. The most interesting part of the presentation, though, was on the unintended consequences of the California Voting Rights Act. And we don't see it right here locally, and we don't see it in larger cities, but throughout the state of California, in smaller communities, there have been some very large impacts that they were highlighting yesterday. I'll just give one example of Big Bear Lake City, which is in the Southern California foothills, a beautiful scenic area that is populated in the all year round with a population of around 20,000 people that vacation there and are, but of that, there's only 5,000 permanent residents and only 2,500 are actual voters. And so for the city council, the school board, and all the special districts, they've been divided down to 500 people per district, and they're not uniform by district areas. And so many of the government agencies, like there and across the state of California, are now operating with 3-member boards because they can't get the recruitment to run from the other districts. And at Big Bear Lake, like in many of the foothill areas in Northern California, you have the native tribes that are considered a protected class. So instead of getting more people involved in government, they're seeing a dearth of people actually being able to apply for positions in their community. And then they're getting into trouble where they're running down to like a single board member or 2 board members where they cannot operate the district. And this is true where we had a lot of communities that went through the fires in the foothills, where the residents that were elected to the board had to vacate their communities. And so the unintended consequences of the California Voting Rights Act was a very interesting part of the discussion, let's say.
Thank you.
Those are all my comments.
Just a quick follow on that. And this election for Ohlone College, Area 7, and Giovanni Hill chose not to run for re-election. And within the 5 days following, no one applied. So they have no applicants at all for this round of the elections. And the board now has to go out and try and recruit someone. who lives in the Warm Springs, Irvington area to apply so that they can be selected by the board for a position on a community college in our.
Hey, maybe I should apply. Like you were at both.
Actually, I don't believe you live in that.
Precedence has already been set.
This is the Flatlands, Paul. The other side of 680 and between 680 and 880. Next, at the Bosco meeting, the board voted, with mine being the sole no vote, is to participate in a recycled water project for 12 million gallons a day in San Mateo County. My concern was that Bosco would be picking up essentially 40+% of the cost of this project, and that Alameda County Water District, I did not feel the East Bay or South Bay district would be beneficiaries of the project, and that they had not addressed the issue, potential issue and emerging issue of PFAS as a hazardous waste in the brine water of recycled water. So how are they going to deal with several million gallons a day of hazardous waste? It will be something they'll have to address hopefully in the process. Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, item 7 is adjourned.
Yes, so for us, we are now adjourned.
5:38 p.m.
And thank the members of the public who sat through our finance committee. It's always helpful.
I'd love to see Paul.